Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Russell here, and potentially one of the biggest decisions of the year is being made tonight in the House of Commons. And Trudeau made his views very, very clear in a press conference this morning, and it seems that the NDP are going to support him in his use of the emergency measures. But is this a clear-cut vote needed to stop a potentially dangerous situation, or is it an instance of political games being played, holding votes and entire parties hostage under the threat of a potential election? So in today's video, we're going to cover those statements from the Prime Minister, as well as the reaction to those statements by different political parties, those very reactions and these statements that have me and so many others quite shocked. But before we do, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and check out the links in the description. Whenever you use those links, you're directly supporting more content like this being made on the YouTube platform. All right, let's get into this and listen in on what Trudeau said just this morning.
After weeks of dangerous and unlawful activities, after weeks of people being harassed in their neighborhoods and small businesses forced to close, after billions of dollars were stalled in trade, putting people's jobs and livelihoods at risk, after the National War Memorial was desecrated, after evidence of increased ideologically motivated violent extremism activity across the country, after a flood of misinformation and disinformation washed over Canada, including from foreign sources, after these illegal blockades and occupations received disturbing amounts of foreign funding to destabilize Canada's democracy, it became clear that local and provincial authorities needed more tools to restore order and keep people safe. Our government will always defend freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly. These values are at the core of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're at the core of who we are as Canadians. In a democracy, you can protest, you can share your opinion at the top of your lungs. You can disagree with elected officials, you can certainly disagree with me. But you can't harass your fellow citizens who disagree with you. You can't hold a city hostage. You can't block a critical trade corridor and deprive people of their jobs. You can't attack journalists for reporting, which is essential to our democracy. What you can do is vote. What you can do is run for office. That's how change happens in a democracy.
So obviously a lot of big statements being made here, chief among which is that there's funding coming in from outside of the country to try to destabilize Canadian democracy. The extent to which that is truly the case is up for debate, but he does go in to make a point here saying you can disagree, you can protest, but you can't harass your fellow citizens, you can't hold a city hostage, you can't do these things that the trucker protesters were doing. And I would generally agree with this, that you can't unlawfully protest, you can't unlawfully block streets, you can't rob people of their freedoms to protest your freedom. But the interesting thing here that Trudeau doesn't bring up is that you don't necessarily need the emergency measures in order to enforce unlawful behavior. If someone's doing something illegally, you can just arrest them and go through the due process in the legal system that we have set up. I don't believe that you necessarily need an Emergency Measures Act in order to actually promote lawfulness. Because when you open the can of worms of an Emergency Measures Act, well, you set a precedent for doing it again in the future, and this is particularly concerning when it comes to financial regulations, where the police could potentially give your information to your banking institution, and you could potentially have your bank account frozen. Now, the Liberals say that they're only going to do this in situations where they see fit, but the precedent that is set is a bigger deal than just how the Liberals are saying they're going to use it now. Let's listen in on how Christian Freeland sort of frames this situation.
In terms of the financial measures, the RCMP has given to the financial institutions names of leaders and organizers of the protests and of people whose trucks were part of occupations and blockades. That is the only information according to the RCMP, that the RCMP has given to financial institutions. We were very clear last Monday that we would be following the money, that we would be using financial tools to disrupt illegal blockades and occupations. The focus absolutely has been on leaders and on the vehicles that were such an important part of the illegal blockades and occupations. That has been the only focus of law enforcement.
So Chrystia Freeland says that they have and will continue to use these financial tools, but she emphasizes that as of what the RCMP is saying, the only information that's been passed over to the banks is from leaders and people who actually had their trucks there. But again, I think that she doesn't recognize the significance of this situation. Let's say, for instance, you 100% support what the Liberals are doing here and taking away the financial freedoms of certain individuals based on what they deem to be negative behavior or unlawful behavior without due process. Imagine if the roles were reversed and there was some sort of a protest around a cause that you were particularly very passionate about. Maybe it had to do with some sort of social justice that you think is very important, and perhaps we had a leader in Canada that wasn't as supportive of those social rights as you. What would it feel like if that leader was to make this claim that, hey, this is undermining our democracy, this is a national emergency, so we are going to stop and freeze the bank accounts of everyone who is involved in this protest that you personally care about? You can understand how this sets a precedent that, while you may not care about its use right now, does have bigger ramifications when you look farther down the road. But the use of this Emergency Measures Act all comes down to a vote that's happening tonight. By the time you're watching this, it may have already happened. So let's listen in on what other parties think, particularly first the NDP. And things get a little bit interesting here because it seems that through certain actions, the Liberals may be threatening other parties if they don't vote in the way that they would like them to. I'll explain in a moment.
And so in response to that failure of leadership to take this seriously, we believe now the measures put in place are taking this threat seriously and are helping to address the serious crisis. Our support from the beginning has always been reluctant. We're reluctant because it should have never got to this point. So we are reluctantly prepared to support the Emergencies Measures Act to protect our democracy, to protect workers, and to particularly target the financing of this very serious convoy, the occupation that has put a serious threat to Canadians, to the residents of Ottawa, and to our democracy.
So you can see that Jagmeet Singh is planning on supporting these measures when it comes to the vote tonight, but it raises an issue that's very close to the NDP's heart. What if you had a situation where people were protesting for workers' rights and the government, whatever government is in power, wasn't a fan of that, and they said that those protests were destabilizing to the democracy? Well, how do you actually determine what is legitimate protest and what is not legitimate protest? And a reporter luckily asks Jagmeet Singh in this very press conference. Let's listen in on the response.
How do you determine what's legitimate protest and what's not? How do you decide that this is not legitimate instead of it just being people saying things that you disagree with?
Well, we can start with the legitimate protest. The protests that we've seen when people are fighting decisions of government, when they're targeted towards a law, a legislation, a decision of government specifically. It's very different, and the efforts in those cases are very different. They're targeting government decisions. They're targeting a piece of legislation. That's very different from what we've seen in this occupation, which targeted people, which targeted residents, which targeted families and children trying to go to school. Like the focus of the attention of the occupation has been on people, and that's wrong. And that's from the outset. That was an illegal use of resources.
So he says that the distinction is between where protests are targeted, whether it be targeted at the individual government and the legislation that they've passed, or targeted at individuals or businesses. But again, this doesn't provide much clarity on what could help them make that decision. For any number of protests, you could say that, hey, they're blocking an area that people need to pass to get to school, or again, think of the example that I said before, before. Let's say that there was a social rights protest and it led to businesses having their windows smashed or vandalism. You could then say, hey, this wasn't targeted at the government. This was targeted at individuals and businesses. So at that point, would you be able to sort of snip their financial ties and use these Emergency Measures Act? The question that's not being answered is the precedent that's being set here, and where are these stopgaps in case there is a government that will abuse this kind of power. Not saying that the Liberal government will abuse this power right now, but by using an act like this that gives a government so much power, you're opening yourself to a number of risks that I think not a lot of people recognize. And I personally question whether or not the NDP truly believe what they're saying, or if they're having their feet held over the fire. Now let me explain. This morning in Justin Trudeau's press conference, he said that this vote tonight will be seen as a matter of confidence. He says it in so many words. You can sort of take away from what he says to say it will be a vote of confidence. When a vote of confidence happens in the House of Commons, if MPs vote down a motion and it is a vote of non-confidence, that triggers an election because the Prime Minister can say, hey, well, the House of Commons doesn't have faith in our leadership, so we need to have another election to see what the Canadian people think. So Justin Trudeau this morning saying this is a vote of confidence means that if people vote against what he's putting forward in this motion, the invocation of the emergency measures, well, then we have a situation where we're headed back to the polls. And even though they didn't necessarily need to interpret this as a vote of no confidence, the Liberals would potentially be able to say, well, you can blame the NDP, you can blame the Conservatives, you can blame the Bloc. They voted against us. They called this election, even though it was the Liberals who said that it will be a vote of no confidence. Do you see where I'm getting at, what I'm getting at here? And luckily, again, for us, the reporter asked Jagmeet Singh about this very question, and the response is, I'll say, a little confusing.
Do you think it's appropriate right now that the Liberals are, in a way, playing political games and kind of pressuring you in a sense to, and saying that this is a confidence vote and that if it does not pass, then the government goes into an election?
Well, I want to be clear on this point. We've always known that since the beginning that this was a confidence vote. I mean, if we compare the invocation of the Emergencies Act versus the throne speech, I mean, this is pretty serious. This is a very serious decision. So we've always known that. And we've based our decision based on how serious the crisis is, how seriously we take the threat of extreme right-wing organizers and the threat of the amount of money that they have and the threat to Canadians and our democracy. So we've always taken this very seriously. And our concern was that all levels of government failed to do so. They failed to take it seriously. And so our decision is based on the protection of Canadians. We've always known that this was an emergency vote, or this vote was a vote of confidence. That is something that we understood right away, that this would naturally be a vote of confidence. And we understood absolutely that we do not want to trigger an election. That would be the worst thing to do in this crisis, that this would somehow also trigger an election. We would never allow that to happen. That would never be acceptable in our opinion. But we know that this is serious, and we're making this decision based on the seriousness of the threat to Canadians and to our liberty, to our democracy. And we take that as something that requires, again, our reluctant, but our support.
So maybe you can start to see where I get a little bit confused here. In the same sentence, Jagmeet Singh here is saying, well, one, we will reluctantly support these emergency measures, and two, him saying that we would never allow an election to happen by any means. We wouldn't allow this election to happen. But you can see that in order for them, if they were to vote down this Emergency Measures Act, well, they would trigger an election. So essentially, because they're triggering an election with their no vote, they have to vote yes. So you can see how the political game of this kind of starts to come into effect. Even though the NDP say that they're making this decision based off of their values, is it really that, or do they not just not want an election that Trudeau is forcing to have triggered if there's a no vote? But now we need to move to the Conservatives, and they bring up that this very same instance where it feels like people's feet are being held over the fire on this vote at threat of an election actually is happening within the Liberal Party itself.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal member for Beaches East York said today in the House, quote, I'm not convinced the emergency measures could extend, I'm not convinced the emergency measures, should extend beyond today, he said. I would vote accordingly, but it's now a confidence vote. It would seem that the Prime Minister is strong-arming his backbench and the NDP to vote in his favour by threatening an election, Mr. Speaker. Isn't that true?
So the Liberal member of Parliament feels like they want to vote no, but they can't because it would be a vote of no confidence, and if enough people vote no, there'd be an election, and he doesn't want an election, so he's going to vote no on this thing, or he's going to vote yes on this thing that he wants to vote no on. You can see how there's sort of these other political motives that factor into this decision that at its base is a very critical decision and meant to be a last resort tool for a government to use in a very extreme situation. And I would argue that we may not be in that currently, and not enough thought is going into the precedent that's being set for the future. And this is also something that's being brought up by the Bloc Québécois. They have their concerns as well. Let's listen in on what they're saying.
The Prime Minister wants us to vote for extraordinary measures to get no trucks and no protesters off the streets in Ottawa. And yet if we oppose it, he'll make it a no confidence vote. So he can call a second unnecessary election in 6 months. But worse than that, what he is demanding means that for the first time in history, the House of Commons would support the use of Emergencies Act to deal with a problem that no longer exists. Does the Prime Minister realize how low a bar he is setting and how damaging a precedent he is setting?
I can't help but feel that this isn't an issue of left and right and conservative or liberal or whoever you voted for in the last election and supporting what their opinion is. I think we need to look a little bit deeper here and what she was talking about, the precedent that is being set here. The protesters have been cleared in Ottawa. There's no longer these major issues that need these kind of extreme actions. So why are they even having a vote on it? Why do they need to bring it in now? And if they do vote on it and bring it into effect, well, what kind of precedent and low bar is being set for the next government that maybe you won't be a fan of coming in and saying this is also emergency because it's worse than the situation for which the last time these emergency measures were enacted? I think that I hope I'm trying to get I hope that my point is coming across clearly here, because I don't get riled up like this very often, and I may look smiling, but it's something I'm concerned about.
Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act is intended to be a last resort to deal with a clear, imminent threat. It's not a sledgehammer to deal with some future unknown crisis. There's no security threat. The streets are empty. The blockades are gone. There's no threat to our democracy. We're here in the House of Commons with the world watching, about to have a critical vote. So if there is no threat, will the Prime Minister end his abuse of the Emergencies Act, or is this just a ploy to ensure that the infringements on Canadians' charter rights and our bank accounts are permanent?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the member would have seen over the course of the last number of days that far from using a sledgehammer, the police have been restrained, they've been patient, and they have been professional in carrying out their responsibilities under the Emergencies Act, which they continue to say is necessary to bring about the end of the illegal occupation here in Ottawa and across the country. Mr. Speaker, there are still risks, but I assure every member in this House that we will sunset the Emergencies Act as soon as we can, and in the meantime, the powers exercised under it will be done in a manner consistent with the Charter.
So we have a questioning of the necessity of this Emergency Measures Act being brought into place, and then we have the Liberal representative coming back and saying, well, actually, we've done a good job here, we've cleared these protests, it's been handled well, and we promise that we'll only use these powers for a short duration of time, and we promise we'll only use them in this one individual spot. But you can see the issue here. This is not a promise that is written into regulation. This is not a promise that is written into law. If this Emergency Measures Act is invoked, it is invoked for everyone, everywhere, and even though the Liberal government here is saying we won't use it for those instances, again, it's not a question of what this Liberal government will do, because I don't personally believe that they're going to censor the transactions of every Canadian and drag this on for an extremely long time. I actually believe that they would only do this for a short amount of time. But the precedent that is set is that if a government argues the same things that the Liberals are arguing here for a different situation, well, then that government may not act in the way that at least I expect the Liberals to if this Emergencies Act passes. It's a matter of precedent, not a matter of the situation that's happening right now. Now, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you'll know I typically don't like to take sides when it comes to these political issues and instead just report what is being said. And I don't feel like I'm taking a side here. I think that I'm sort of putting forward what my concern is, and it just so happens that the Conservatives in the Bloc Québécois are the ones saying it right now. If you've watched this channel, you know that I've stand up for a lot of very left-leaning principles and supports and spending programs in the past, and have covered those very accurately and very carefully, and not just a sort of spewed conservative dialogue for the most part on this channel. But I hope that I'm not coming across too much on one side here, but it's something that I'm concerned about, and it's something that just so happens to be argued by the Conservatives in the Bloc Québécois in this instance. It's definitely going to be interesting to watch which way the vote goes tonight and what those impacts are down the road, but I would feel like I didn't do myself justice if I didn't come out and sort of talk about what my current opinion is on this issue. And I'm sure that you have an opinion as well. If you think I'm wrong and I'm a total idiot, let me know in the comments. I want this channel to be a place where people of different views can come in and state what they believe and what they think. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree. I want to see it all down there in the comments, and I appreciate you for doing that in a constructive way and in a mature way, and I have that faith in the audience that watches these videos. So I appreciate you for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time.